By a very quick reminder tonight, Habakkuk was a minor prophet who lived in 625 BC. He was a contemporary, a prophet during the time of Zephaniah and the prophet Jeremiah. The northern kingdom of Israel, of course, fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC, and the southern kingdom of Judah was on the verge of a fall by the Babylonians, and Habakkuk is called to preach to Judah and proclaim to them a message of repentance to turn from their sins. Now, when you read the book of Habakkuk, it's interesting that he's the only prophet you'll read about who doesn't address the people directly. He addresses them as a written word, as just like you read it now, you would have read his words in that day and age. You can divide this into, Habakkuk has 3 chapters. And the first 2/3 of Habakkuk, or the first 2 of the 3 chapters, it's Habakkuk talking to God. And the final chapter, chapter number 3, Habakkuk simply prays. So we get a chance to eavesdrop into the conversation between Habakkuk and God, and then you get a chance to hear his prayer. So the first 2 chapters are basically a question and answer. He questions God's sovereignty. He questions how God would let things happen, and then God responds. And then he questions God again, and God responds again. This goes on for 2 chapters, and then the 3rd chapter, he simply prays to God. So Habakkuk lived at a time between the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 and between the time of the fall of the southern kingdom in 586 BC. He saw Judah's moral and spiritual decline during this period, and this troubled him deeply. Here's the 2 complaints that Habakkuk gives to God. The first complaint, which we looked at last time in some detail, is this: the law of God is being neglected, which is evident in corrupt leaders who have turned a blind eye to violence and injustice. That was his first complaint. God, how could you let evil happen in this world? How could you let bad things happen? How could you let these people of yours go astray? How could you let the people who are vulnerable suffer? He said, God, the people of Judah are wicked. They've turned away from you. And that's it. They exploit the poor and the weak. And then in verse 6, God says, well, I've got an answer for that. I'm going to bring the Babylonians to wipe out, to judge your nation, to displace them, and to defeat them and kill women, all your women and children, those kinds of things. And then Habakkuk comes back with a second complaint. And here's the complaint. How could a good and just God use a pagan nation like Babylon to punish God's covenant people, which is Judah? So he says, God, I want you to correct the problem, not to kill everyone. I want you to drain the swamp, not to vaporize with a nuclear bomb. I wanted you to fix the problem, not kill everyone in the room, right? So how can God use such awful people like the pagan Babylonians to bring about punishment on people of Judah? I said last time, and you guys know this old saying that even God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick, that God uses people who are wicked and corrupt to bring about his good pleasure. And that's good that God uses imperfect people to carry out his will, Isaac, because we're just imperfect people, aren't we? That's the only kind of folks that God has to work with. So in this dialogue, God says not only will he judge Judah for their sins by using Babylon, but he'll also use Babylon. He'll also judge Babylon for their sins as well. So that's interesting. And the takeaway from the first part of this is that God says you must learn to lean on me. When things don't seem to be going right, you must trust that I am a sovereign God who knows all things. Let's take a look tonight at Habakkuk's second complaint in detail and God's response. And so verse 12 begins the second complaint. 12a. You can divide a verse up into A and B if there's punctuation in the middle of that. So we have a question mark. So the first part of Habakkuk, verse 12a, ends with a question mark. And here it is, Habakkuk talking. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die, period. So within this complaint, Habakkuk makes some important assumptions about God. I think they're basic doctrines about God. Notice that he says, God, you are from everlasting. Habakkuk 1:12a says this, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. He assumes that God is from everlasting. Now, what does that mean, that God is from everlasting? It means God is eternal, that God has no beginning. Just this past week, Cara asked a question of Mom here. She said, how can God have no beginning? That's a good question, isn't it? That's a question we begin to ask about middle school age. We begin to ask these questions about God, put in our mind, because we know everything that exists has a cause for its existence in something else. Every time you see a person, that person was once a baby. That baby came from some other person, right? Every mighty oak you see was once an acorn, and that acorn dropped from another oak tree, right? So everything you see has cause for its existence in something else. And when we begin to grow up in our maturity and begin to think as we mature in our thoughts, we begin to ask the question of God, well, where did God come from? Who gave birth to God? What causes gods to happen? Where do gods come from?
Who's God's parents?
Yeah, who's God's parents? I will now present to you guys the famous Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. So I'll put this on the screen. Here's a famous argument for the existence of God. And here's the first premise. Let Isaac put that on the screen for us. The Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. First premise.
It's frozen.
It's frozen. Okay, we'll warm it up. May have to hit from beginning slide or something like that. Close it out and bring it up if you want to.
Bring it back up.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think it's good that we see this. Sometimes, there it is. There you go. So the cosmological argument for the existence of God has two premises and a conclusion. It's a very basic sort of philosophical approach of proving that God exists. Here's some way to prove that God exists. I'll let Isaac pull it up for us there.
Oh, it's not your fault.
Frozen up like
Not your fault at all.
it's wintertime. There we go. Okay, so here's the first premise. Number one is this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, and I said earlier, if there was a point in your life that you begin to exist, you had a cause to why you exist. That's pretty basic stuff. Chicken or the egg? Which came first? Chicken or egg? Well, every chicken comes from an egg, but an egg's got to be dropped by a chicken somewhere. That's kind of where it goes. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence outside of itself. Premise one. Second premise is this. The universe began to exist. Whether you think the universe is 10,000 years old or 13 billion years old, it doesn't matter the starting point. You must all agree that at one point the universe began to exist. Either the Big Bang happened 13 billion years ago and out of nothing came everything, or 10,000 years ago the universe came as the direct fiat, the direct power of God as He spoke into creation. Either way, you got to say that the universe began to exist. It must have a cause for existence outside of itself. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. If the universe exists, and it didn't exist eternally, and it began at some point and back in time somewhere, whether it's 10,000 years ago or 13 billion years ago, it doesn't matter the starting point. It had to exist. And if it began to exist somewhere and it has a cause, if it has a cause, what is the cause? The cause, of course, is God. This is one of those arguments called the cosmological argument, which means cosmos deals with the universe, the material universe. We look at that God must exist based upon reasoning from what we can see. That something that made the universe exist was not a something, but a someone. That God spoke and the universe began. Now, this argument does not state, this is important that we get this. This is where our minds mature and we stop being a 12-year-old child and start being an adult in our thinking here philosophically. The argument does not say that everything that exists had a cause, only that everything that begins to exist had a cause. You see the difference? Here's the difference. God exists, but God never began to exist. God exists, but there was never a time when God didn't exist. God exists, but there was never a time when God was a baby God and grew up to be the adult God that He is now. God exists, but there was never a time when God was born from other gods. God exists because He's always existed. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. It has a cause. That cause is God. God never began to exist. God has always existed. He is eternal. He is transcendent, outside of creation, outside of time. He's over it, above it, before it, beyond it, and He would be here long after the universe wipes up. God spoke and all creation began. There was a time when there was nothing in the universe but God. No stars, no vacuum of space, no darkness, no light, no anything but God himself. And God spoke and everything began to exist. There was never a time when there was not God. The prophet Habakkuk acknowledges this simple truth. You are from everlasting. You know, every year at Christmas time, we often think of that verse because we sometimes sing it in our songs. And we certainly read it in the Christmas story. Isaiah 9:6 says this, For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. What the angels announce in Bethlehem, the birth of Jesus to the shepherds, is go look over in Bethlehem. You'll find this baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Today is born to you in the city of David a child, right? What Isaiah prophesied is that a child was born in Bethlehem, but the son was given. Same person, an important distinction. The Son of God existed from eternity past, always has been, but the child in Bethlehem was born in time. It maybe makes more sense to read it from Young's literal translation. This is a translation of the Bible used in the Hebrew in a very literal way. Young's literal translation says this, For a child hath been born to us, a son hath been given to us, and the princely power is on his shoulder. He doth call his name Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of eternity, Prince of Peace. Now the prophet didn't confuse the Messiah with God the Father. He wasn't saying that Jesus is God the Father, but he said Jesus is the Father of eternity. Another way of saying that Jesus is like Father Time. He's been around forever. And the prophet Habakkuk says the same thing, that Christ, that God, you've been here forever. Since before anything was God, you've always been. So what happened in Bethlehem? We're about to enter the Christmas season here in the next couple of months, and we'll be looking at this in more detail in the future. But what we know about, as we can reason as theologians, is this, that the Logos, the divine nature of Jesus, always was, always existed. But at the incarnation, when he became a fertilized zygote in the womb of Mary, he added to himself a human nature. Unto us a son is given. Unto us a child is born. The human nature added to the Godhead in the incarnation was the biological offspring of Mary. So think of this. There was a time when Jesus was not, because Jesus is the human nature of the divine Logos. But the divine Logos, the divine part of Jesus, has always been around because he is in fact a member of the Godhead. But at the incarnation, he took upon himself a human nature, and in the marriage of the two became the God-man. Now that's the hypostatic union doctrine. It's hard for us to grasp what that means, but basically is this, that Jesus of Nazareth, who walked upon the earth, his human